The gala of broken promises. The night glittered like a dream that had been polished for years, every reflection in the crystal chandeliers whispering wealth, power, and pretense. The Rosewood Grand Hotel had never looked more alive, its marble floors gleaming beneath 1,000 footsteps dressed in couture and confidence. Laughter floated through the ballroom like bubbles rising in champagne, delicate, practiced, and hollow. Behind that laughter hid 1,000 private battles, but none as hidden as the one Sophia Laurent was fighting within herself. 7 months pregnant and still radiant as if carved from grace itself, she stood behind the velvet curtain, her hands resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly. Her ivory gown flowed like moonlight, her hair pinned into a perfect updo that framed the calm determination of her face. To everyone else, she looked like a woman living the dream, a beloved wife, a soon-to-be mother, and the partner of one of the most admired millionaires in the city. Yet in that still moment, beneath the weight of applause echoing from the ballroom, she felt something cold stirring in her chest, a quiet warning she could not name. Richard Ashford, her husband of 4 years, was out there now, commanding the stage as if born to be adored. His voice carried the easy charm of a man who had never known failure. The cameras loved him. The investors worshipped him. The city called him a self-made visionary. But Sophia knew another Richard, the one who once laughed with her over burnt toast in their tiny first apartment, who promised her that love would always matter more than money. Somewhere along the way that Richard had vanished behind the walls of his empire. Tonight she had planned to remind him of that promise. Her speech, carefully handwritten and folded in her clutch, was supposed to celebrate his achievements while announcing her new charity initiative, a way to build a legacy of compassion alongside their success. She had imagined him proud, smiling down at her with the warmth she used to see in his eyes. But as the applause swelled again, something in the tone of the crowd shifted. Murmurs rippled like unease across the room. Then, before she could comprehend what was happening, the world she knew cracked apart. Through the backstage monitor, she saw him. Richard standing beneath the chandeliers, his smile sharper than glass, his arm extended toward the side of the stage. Out from the shadows glided Celeste Monroe, the golden-haired face of Ashford Properties. The cameras caught her every move, the shimmer of her gown, the way she leaned into the light as though she had rehearsed this moment 100 times in front of a mirror. The audience gasped. The violinist stumbled on a note. Then Richard's voice, smooth as ever, filled the air with words that sliced straight into Sophia's heart. "This woman," he said, "has been my inspiration these past months." The pause that followed was unbearable, a silence thick with confusion. Then he pulled Celeste close and kissed her. Not a courteous, staged kiss, but one that belonged to private passion, the kind that rewrites vows and ruins lives. Sophia stood motionless. The monitor blurred as tears clouded her vision, yet she could not look away. Every heartbeat felt like thunder in her ears. Margaret, her assistant and friend, whispered something, pleased to leave, to stop watching. But her voice was distant, drowned beneath the roar of disbelief that filled the ballroom. Cameras flashed. Guests whispered her name, and the man she had trusted more than anyone in the world declared to millions that he had found something real. The humiliation was unbearable, yet somewhere beneath the pain a new feeling was awakening, clarity. He had not just betrayed her privately, he had destroyed her publicly, perhaps thinking she would crumble in silence. But Sophia Laurent was not a woman who broke easily. She had survived worse storms than this. Her parents' passing, the years of struggle building a name for herself, the sacrifices she had made for his career, all of it had forged steel beneath her softness. And if Richard wanted to strip her dignity on a stage, then she would reclaim it there too, beneath the same cruel spotlight. She pressed a hand to her belly, drawing strength from the tiny heartbeat within. "You don't have to face this," Margaret pleaded again, her voice trembling. Sophia turned to her slowly, her expression calm but resolute. "He chose to make this public," she said quietly. "Then the truth will also be public." At that moment, a familiar voice came from the hallway. Julian Cross, CEO of Cross Industries, stepped through the door like an anchor of stability amid chaos. Tall, composed, and known for his unshakable integrity, he was everything Richard had once aspired to be. Julian had attended the gala as a sponsor, but when the scandal broke across the ballroom, he had left his table immediately, his instincts sharpened by years of crisis management. He had seen Sophia backstage before, kind, humble, passionate about charity work, and he could not stand idle while she was humiliated before the entire city. "Mrs. Laurent," he said gently, his tone warm yet firm, "you don't have to face this alone. Let me walk with you." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, seeing not pity but respect in his eyes. That difference mattered more than anything. She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." He extended his arm and she placed her hand on it, steadying herself. Together they walked toward the stage entrance, Margaret following close behind, her heart pounding in sympathy and fear. When Sophia appeared at the far end of the ballroom, the room fell into stunned silence. Every camera turned, every whisper died. The woman Richard Ashford had betrayed now walked with the poise of a queen, her ivory gown glowing under the chandeliers, her belly a symbol of both vulnerability and strength. She did not rush. She did not falter. Each step was deliberate, graceful, and unshakably human. The crowd parted instinctively, journalists gasping as they realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. Richard froze mid-sentence. The color drained from his face as Sophia stopped a few feet from the stage. The microphone still carried his breathless silence, every viewer at home witnessing his unraveling. Julian Cross stood beside her, calm and commanding, his gaze fixed on Richard with quiet contempt. Sophia's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried with a strength that pierced the silence. "You wanted honesty, Richard," she said, her words steady, measured, and painfully clear. "So here it is." Every camera leaned in. Every guest leaned forward. "I believed in you," she continued, her voice trembling only once. "I believed in the man who promised me that success would never come at the cost of love. I gave you everything, my trust, my support, my dreams, and you repaid me with betrayal. You didn't just break your vows. You broke the foundation of everything we built together." Richard tried to interject, but she lifted a hand, silencing him with quiet authority. "You say our marriage was over, but you never had the courage to tell me that. Instead, you chose to humiliate me in front of the world. But I will not let you define my story." The room was so silent that the hum of the stage lights could be heard. Somewhere near the back, applause began, tentative at first, then spreading like a rising tide. People stood not out of gossip, but out of respect. In that moment, Sophia Laurent became more than a betrayed wife. She became a symbol of dignity reclaimed. Julian stepped forward slightly, not speaking, only offering quiet presence. His eyes met hers, and she found in them the strength to breathe again. For the first time since the night began, she felt seen, not as a scandal, not as a victim, but as herself. Richard's empire would crumble after that night. The headlines would devour him, the investors would retreat, and Celeste Monroe would learn that fame built on heartbreak fades fast. But Sophia's story was only beginning. Beneath the pain lay purpose. She would rebuild her life not for revenge, but for the child growing inside her, a reminder that even shattered hearts can beat with new hope. And as Julian Cross guided her away from the glare of cameras into the quiet hallway beyond, she felt something shift inside her. Not love, at least not yet, but peace. Fragile, trembling peace born from truth. For the first time in months, she could finally breathe, and when she did, it was not in pieces. It was whole. The storm after the spotlight, the morning after the gala, broke like the aftermath of an earthquake, silent at first, and then roaring with aftershocks that reached every corner of the city. News outlets replayed the clip endlessly, each channel analyzing every glance, every gesture, every second of Richard Ashford's public betrayal. The image of him kissing Celeste Monroe beneath the glittering chandeliers had become the scandal of the decade, a symbol of ego and arrogance dressed in designer perfection. Yet the image that stayed with the people longer was not his kiss, but Sophia Laurent standing tall in her ivory gown, her pregnant silhouette shining like quiet defiance against humiliation. She hadn't screamed, hadn't wept in front of cameras. She had spoken with truth, with calm dignity that shook the illusion of power more than rage ever could. By sunrise, social media was flooded with messages of support. Hashtags like #Stand with Sophia and Grace Under Fire trended across platforms, turning her into an unintentional icon of strength and self-respect. But for Sophia herself, there was no triumph, only silence, exhaustion, and a heart that still ached with the betrayal of someone she had loved completely. She sat by the window of her apartment hours later, her once perfect hair now falling loose around her face, her gown traded for a simple white robe. The city stretched before her in soft shades of gray, the traffic below moving with indifferent rhythm. Margaret had stayed overnight, fielding calls from journalists, blocking numbers, trying to build a shield around Sophia's fragile peace. "They want interviews, exclusives, statements," she said quietly, her voice rough with fatigue. "Even the morning shows are offering to pay." Sophia turned from the window slowly, her expression unreadable. "I have nothing to sell," she murmured, her hand resting on her belly. The truth was already spoken. The rest is just noise. She said it softly, but with a kind of finality that made Margaret stop arguing. There was a quiet power in Sophia that no scandal could erase. It was the power of a woman who had faced the worst and chosen dignity over destruction. Down in the city's financial district, however, destruction had already begun. Investors had started pulling out of Ashford properties before noon. The board demanded an emergency meeting, and within hours the company's shares had plummeted by 25%. Richard sat in his office surrounded by chaos, assistants whispering, phones ringing nonstop, PR teams trying to draft damage control statements that all sounded hollow. Celeste Monroe sat across from him in silence, her golden confidence dimmed. For the first time, she saw not the charming millionaire who had promised her the world, but a man unraveling beneath the weight of his own ego. "It'll blow over," Richard muttered, running a trembling hand through his hair. "People forget. They always do." But even he didn't believe his own words. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the cold certainty that this was different. The world hadn't turned against him because of an affair. It had turned because of arrogance, because of the cruelty of doing it in public, and because of the quiet strength of the woman he had tried to destroy. Julian Cross, meanwhile, watched the headlines unfold from his office overlooking the river. The night before had left a mark on him he hadn't expected. He had attended dozens of galas, witnessed countless scandals among the city's elite, but none had unsettled him like that moment when Sophia had stepped into the light with such calm courage. There was something deeply human about her composure, something that spoke of both pain and unbreakable grace. When he had walked her out of the ballroom, the cameras had followed them, and though he hadn't intended it, his name now appeared in every headline beside hers. "The pregnant wife walks out with another CEO." The phrasing was cruelly misleading, twisting an act of protection into gossip, yet Julian didn't care about his reputation. What bothered him was that she was being dragged through a storm she hadn't chosen. By afternoon he made a decision. He called Margaret, who answered cautiously, thinking it was another reporter. "This is Julian Cross," he said, his tone calm but direct. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Laurent. No interviews, no cameras, just a conversation." There was hesitation, then a quiet sigh of relief. "She could use a friend right now," Margaret admitted softly. "She hasn't eaten since last night." An hour later, Julian arrived at Sophia's apartment carrying a box of pastries from a small French cafe known for its warmth more than its fame. When she opened the door, she looked surprised. Not because he was there, but because he carried himself not like a man who pitied her, but like one who respected her strength. He didn't mention the scandal, didn't offer rehearsed sympathy. Instead, he placed the box on the table and said simply, "You look like you haven't eaten. May I sit?" It was such a normal human thing to say that Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, gesturing toward the couch. For a while they sat in silence, the city noise drifting faintly through the window. Finally, Julian spoke. "You were extraordinary last night. Not many people could have done what you did." Sophia smiled faintly, though the sadness in her eyes softened his heart. "I didn't feel extraordinary," she said. "I felt broken. But I couldn't let him take my voice too." Julian studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's what makes you strong. Not because you didn't break, but because you chose how to rise." His words settled in her like a balm. Not flattery, but truth spoken with respect. They talked for nearly 2 hours, about everything but the scandal. About books, about her plans for her charity project, about the baby she was already imagining holding. For the first time since the gala, Sophia laughed softly. Not out of joy, but out of relief that conversation could still feel normal. When Julian stood to leave, he said, "If you ever need a place to breathe away from all this noise, my company's foundation has a private retreat outside the city. You'd be welcome there any time. It wasn't an offer of rescue, but of refuge, and she thanked him sincerely. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Sophia sat at her desk and opened a blank notebook. For years, she had supported Richard's empire, written his speeches, managed his charities. Now she decided to write her own story, not for the press, but for herself. The first line she wrote was simple. The woman who was broken last night will build something beautiful tomorrow. Her tears fell on the ink, but she didn't wipe them away. They belonged there. Days turned into weeks, and slowly she began to rebuild her life. The scandal that had once defined her began to shift into something else. People no longer spoke of her as the pregnant wife, but as the woman who stood for self-respect in a world that worshipped image over integrity. Invitations arrived from women's organizations, charities, even universities asking her to speak about resilience. Yet she turned most of them down. She wasn't ready to perform her healing. She wanted to live it quietly first. Meanwhile, Richard's downfall was accelerating. The board voted to suspend him as CEO, pending a review of his misuse of company funds. Celeste Monroe, realizing that his fortune was collapsing, began missing his calls. The mansion that once hosted their glamorous parties became a cage of silence. He had traded love for vanity, and now both had abandoned him. Sophia, however, found peace not in revenge but in simplicity. She spent her mornings walking through the park, her evenings writing, and her nights feeling her baby kick gently, as if reminding her that life always moves forward. Julian visited occasionally, never uninvited, never intrusive. Their connection deepened in quiet moments, in shared cups of tea, in conversations that stretched past midnight, in the way he listened to her without trying to fix her. For Sophia, it wasn't love yet, but something even more precious. Trust reborn. One afternoon, months later, she finally accepted Julian's invitation to visit the foundation retreat. Nestled among rolling hills and surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind, it was a place untouched by gossip or greed. As she walked along the path lined with blooming lavender, she felt her heart begin to heal. Julian met her there, not as a CEO, not as a savior, but simply as a friend who understood that healing isn't found in headlines. It's found in stillness, in kindness, in people who see you for who you truly are. That night, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in gold and violet, Julian said quietly, "The world thinks strength means never falling apart. But I think true strength is knowing how to rebuild after you do." Sophia looked at him, her eyes reflecting both the fading light and something new, a quiet acceptance that maybe, just maybe, life had a way of turning endings into beginnings. The city's noise still waited beyond the horizon, but for now it felt far away. The woman who had once stood trembling before a crowd now stood beneath the open sky, her heart steady, her spirit unbroken, and her story, finally, her own. The return of shadows and the dawn of strength. The months that followed brought both peace and transformation to Sophia Laurent's life. The scandal that had once consumed every headline eventually began to fade beneath newer distractions. Yet its echoes remained, soft, persistent, like the faint hum of a storm long past but never forgotten. The city had moved on, but Sophia's journey was still unfolding. Each day was a delicate dance between memory and renewal. The mornings began with quiet sunlight streaming through her apartment window, the air filled with the scent of lavender from the retreat Julian had taken her to weeks earlier. It had become her sanctuary, a place where she could think, heal, and prepare for the new chapter about to enter her life. Her pregnancy had advanced gracefully. The baby, once a small flutter beneath her ribs, now made its presence known with gentle kicks that reminded her of both responsibility and resilience. There were nights when she lay awake, one hand over her belly, whispering promises to the life within her. Promises that this child would grow up knowing love not as possession, but as protection. Margaret had become more than an assistant during these months. She was family, moving through the apartment like quiet assurance, managing calls, donations for Sophia's new charity, and the steady stream of letters that poured in from women across the world who saw Sophia not as a victim, but as a voice for every woman who had ever been humiliated and still chosen dignity. Julian Cross remained a steady, comforting presence through it all. Their friendship had deepened in ways neither of them had expected. He often stopped by after long meetings, bringing fresh flowers or rare books he thought she might enjoy. His visits weren't grand gestures. They were thoughtful ones. Sometimes they would sit together for hours without needing to speak, the silence between them soft, unforced, almost sacred. On other evenings, he would help her review plans for her foundation, which aimed to support single mothers rebuilding their lives after betrayal or loss. "You're turning pain into purpose," Julian said one night as he looked over her proposal drafts. "That's not easy. Most people just turn it into bitterness." Sophia smiled faintly, her hand tracing the curve of a handwritten quote she had pinned to the wall. "When they bury you in darkness, remember, you are a seed." But even as new beginnings took root, old ghosts began to stir. Richard Ashford had fallen hard from his pedestal. The board had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO. The company restructured under interim leadership, and several investigations began into his misuse of investor funds. Celeste Monroe, whose beauty had once been his pride, quietly disappeared from his side within weeks of the collapse. Public sympathy that once favored him evaporated completely. Alone in a penthouse now stripped of its warmth, Richard began to unravel under the weight of regret. His nights were sleepless, his phone calls to Sophia unanswered. The more she thrived, the more his pride twisted into desperation. And when the press released photos of Sophia walking through the park with Julian Cross, her hand on her belly and a serene smile on her lips, Richard's rage flared into something dangerous. He couldn't understand how she could look so whole when he felt so broken. Then one cold evening, as rain streaked across the city's glass towers, Sophia heard the sound she hadn't expected again, the buzz of the intercom followed by Margaret's startled voice. "Sophia, it's him." For a moment, time froze. Her pen slipped from her fingers as memories flooded back. The stage, the cameras, the sting of betrayal. She took a deep breath before answering. "Let him up." Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Minutes later, Richard stood in her doorway, a ghost of the man who had once commanded the world's admiration. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his voice rough with sleepless guilt. "Sophia, I had to see you." She stood by the window, her hands resting protectively on her stomach, her posture calm but distant. "Why now, Richard? After everything?" He hesitated, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I was wrong. About everything. I lost sight of what mattered. The company, the money, Celeste. None of it means anything now. You were my home, Sophia. You always were." For a long time, she said nothing. The sound of rain filled the silence between them. Finally, she turned to face him fully, her eyes steady, her tone neither angry nor forgiving, simply honest. "You didn't lose sight of what mattered, Richard. You chose what mattered to you. And it wasn't me." He flinched as if struck, and for the first time tears filled his eyes. "Please, Sophia. I don't want your forgiveness. I just want to make things right. I want to be there for our child." Her heart trembled at the mention of their baby, but she drew herself taller. "You'll have that chance," she said softly. "Not as a husband, but as a father, if you can learn to be one. But this time the story isn't about you. It's about what kind of world we build for the innocent life you helped create." Richard nodded slowly, broken by her grace. "I don't deserve your kindness," he murmured. "No," she agreed quietly. "But our child does." With that, she dismissed him gently, and as the elevator doors closed behind him, Sophia felt the last thread of her old life loosen and fall away. Weeks later, her son was born on a crisp spring morning, beneath a sky painted with the soft gold of dawn. She named him Elias after her late father, whose wisdom had once guided her through life's earliest storms. The delivery was long, but when she finally heard the cry of her newborn, it was as if the world exhaled with her. Margaret wept openly beside her bed, while Julian, who had arrived at the hospital hours earlier, waited quietly outside, his heart pounding with worry he didn't dare show. When the nurse finally let him in, Sophia lay exhausted but radiant, cradling the small bundle of warmth against her chest. She looked up and smiled weakly. "Meet Elias," she whispered. Julian approached carefully, his expression softening as he gazed at the sleeping child. "He's perfect," he said, "just like his mother." Their eyes met then, not in romance but in something deeper. Gratitude, respect, a shared understanding of everything it had taken to reach this moment. For Sophia, it was a reminder that not all endings were tragedies. Some were rebirths in disguise. In the weeks that followed, she recovered slowly, surrounded by love and calm rather than luxury or headlines. Her foundation officially launched, receiving overwhelming support. Her first project funded housing for displaced mothers and their children, a cause that resonated deeply with thousands. When she spoke at the launch event, her voice carried the same calm conviction that had silenced a ballroom months ago. "I once believed my worth came from who I stood beside," she told the audience. "Now I know it comes from who I choose to stand as." The applause that followed wasn't wild or shallow. It was reverent, the kind that rises when truth meets strength. Julian watched from the side of the stage, his heart heavy with admiration. He had seen her at her lowest and now stood witness to her ascent. He didn't need to claim her story. He only wanted to support the woman who had learned how to turn pain into power. Far away, Richard watched the broadcast from his quiet apartment, his eyes misting as he realized that what he had destroyed out of pride had transformed into something greater than his empire ever could. Sophia had become a symbol not just of endurance, but of rebirth, proof that even after betrayal, love could still exist in purer forms, stripped of illusion and ownership. That night, when Julian visited to check on her and Elias, Sophia met him at the door, the baby asleep in her arms. "You've done so much for us," she said softly. "I don't even know how to thank you." Julian smiled gently. "You already have," he replied. "You showed me what courage really looks like." She looked at him for a long time, the silence between them warm and unspoken, and for the first time since her world had shattered beneath chandeliers, she felt something stir inside her, not fear, not loneliness, but the fragile beginning of hope. The woman who had once walked through humiliation now walked through light, carrying her child and her future in her arms, her past behind her, her strength ahead. The world had seen her broken, but now it would see her whole, not because she was untouched by pain, but because she had chosen to rise beyond it. And as Julian stood watching her from the threshold, he knew what the world would soon learn too, that sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with a kiss, but with the courage to heal. The rise of grace months drifted into seasons, and the quiet rhythm of Sophia Laurent's life became the most beautiful contradiction imaginable. A life once shattered by scandal, now rebuilt upon foundations of serenity and purpose. Her mornings began with soft laughter echoing through the apartment as little Elias kicked in his cradle, sunlight spilling over lace curtains and painting warmth across the walls. The city that had once whispered her name in gossip now spoke it in admiration. The world that had once pitied her now looked to her for guidance. What had begun as a story of betrayal had evolved into something far greater, a story of redemption, resilience, and rebirth. Sophia's foundation, the Elias Initiative, grew faster than anyone predicted. What started as a modest organization, helping single mothers find housing, soon became a network of empowerment programs across multiple cities. She traveled when she could, often with Elias in her arms and Margaret by her side, speaking to communities about reclaiming dignity after heartbreak. Her voice carried the same calm conviction that had silenced a ballroom months earlier, but now it resonated with a richer purpose. To remind people that strength is not loud, it is consistent. Julian Cross remained her closest confidant and quiet anchor through the expansion. Where others offered applause, he offered balance. Where the world called her a hero, he simply called her human. Together they made a remarkable team, his strategic mind and her compassionate vision turning pain into policy, wounds into opportunities, and stories of abandonment into blueprints for renewal. Behind the glow of success, however, life tested her with subtler trials. Every triumph brought memories of what it had cost her to stand alone. Some nights, when the city lights blinked like distant constellations, she caught herself wondering if love could ever be simple again. Julian had become an inseparable part of her new world, always steady, never intrusive. He adored Elias as if the child were his own, reading him stories, building toy rockets on the carpet, laughing in a way that made Sophia's heart soften in gratitude and confusion alike. She felt drawn to him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to feel for anyone since Richard, not out of loneliness but out of recognition. He understood her without needing explanations. He saw her not as a survivor, but as a woman still capable of dreaming. Yet Sophia feared the judgment of a world that loved headlines more than truth. She had built her strength publicly. Could she risk her heart privately again? Meanwhile, the ghost of Richard Ashford lingered at the edge of her peace. After being ousted from his company, he disappeared from the public eye, living quietly in a smaller apartment funded by the sale of his mansion. He attended therapy, volunteered anonymously at shelters, and tried to understand the emptiness that had hollowed him. The empire he once worshipped had devoured his soul, and in its ruins he discovered humility for the first time. Months passed before he gathered the courage to reach out, not to reclaim, but to atone. When Sophia received his letter, handwritten and trembling with remorse, she read it twice before folding it away. It did not rekindle old feelings. It simply closed an unfinished chapter. She knew forgiveness was not a gift for him. It was a release for herself. One evening, as autumn painted the park in copper and gold, Sophia hosted the first anniversary gala for the Elias Initiative. Unlike the glittering chaos of the Rosewood Hotel a year ago, this event was quiet, intimate, filled with warmth rather than spectacle. There were no paparazzi, no chandeliers flashing like accusation, just laughter, candlelight, and stories of lives transformed. Julian arrived late, his dark suit perfectly tailored but his eyes soft with pride. When he found Sophia on the terrace overlooking the city, she was holding a glass of sparkling water, her hair lifted gently by the evening breeze. "You built something extraordinary," he said, his voice low. She turned to him with a smile that carried gratitude and something deeper. "I didn't build it alone," she replied. "The right people walked in when the wrong ones walked out." For a long moment they stood together watching the skyline, the memory of the old Rosewood Gala flickering faintly in their minds, the night that had destroyed her and somehow delivered her into this one. Julian hesitated before speaking again. "Sophia, there's something I've wanted to say for months." His tone was calm, yet behind it, emotion pulsed like the rhythm of a heart long restrained. She met his gaze, unsure of what she was ready to hear. "When I first saw you walk onto that stage last year," he continued, "I thought I was witnessing courage. But now I realize it was something greater, grace. You taught me that grace isn't quiet forgiveness. It's the choice to rise without becoming what hurt you." Sophia felt her breath catch, her chest tightening with emotions she had locked away for too long. "Julian," she began, but he stopped her gently. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that whatever comes next, you will never face it alone." Later that night, after the last guest had gone and Elias slept peacefully in his room, Sophia sat on the balcony wrapped in a shawl, watching the city glow beneath her. For the first time, she felt no fear of tomorrow. She opened her journal and wrote slowly beneath the line she had once written months ago, "The woman who was broken last night will build something beautiful tomorrow." Now she added, "And the woman who built it has finally found peace." Her pen paused, and a smile touched her lips as she heard the soft footsteps behind her. Julian stood in the doorway holding a cup of tea. He did not speak. He simply sat beside her, the two of them gazing into the quiet magnificence of a city that no longer felt like a cage but a canvas. In the distance, Richard Ashford watched the same sky from his own window, a man finally learning that redemption is not something you receive from others, but something you earn through time and truth. He had begun speaking at rehabilitation centers for fallen executives, telling them his story not as a warning of shame, but as a lesson in humility. He never expected Sophia's forgiveness, but he had learned to forgive himself enough to start again. By the time winter came, the city had changed, and so had she. The woman who once stood behind a curtain trembling with heartbreak was now the face of healing. Her story taught in seminars, her voice invited to forums about women in leadership. Yet beneath the titles and recognition, Sophia remained what she had always been, a woman who believed in the quiet power of goodness. She would smile when people called her a symbol, but in her heart, she knew she was simply someone who chose to keep walking when the world expected her to fall. And as the snow fell softly against the window that night, Sophia whispered to Elias, who stirred gently in his sleep, "You were born from the ashes of a storm, my love, and you will grow under a sky filled with stars." Outside, the world seemed to listen. The city that had once witnessed her humiliation now stood as the backdrop to her triumph. And in that tranquil moment, Sophia Laurent finally understood what true victory was. Not revenge, not recognition, but peace. The light upon the storm years passed, not in haste but in harmony, as if time itself had chosen to move gently around Sophia Laurent and the life she had so patiently rebuilt. The woman who had once stood trembling behind a velvet curtain, betrayed under the blinding glare of chandeliers, now walked through each day with a quiet confidence that drew strength from every wound she had once carried. Her name, once dragged through scandal, had become a symbol of grace. The Elias Initiative had spread across continents, building schools, shelters, and empowerment programs that touched thousands of lives. The world saw her as an emblem of perseverance. Yet to those close to her, she remained the same, humble, grounded, and deeply human. Her son, Elias, had grown into a spirited little boy with eyes full of curiosity and laughter that filled the halls of their home like music. He carried his mother's compassion and her late father's calm strength. Every evening, Sophia would watch him from her desk as he built tiny towers from wooden blocks, then toppled them just to start again. And in that simple act, she saw the reflection of her own life, breaking, rebuilding, rising again. Margaret still worked with her, now managing an entire team of volunteers, her loyalty unwavering and her affection for Elias almost maternal. The small apartment where Sophia once hid from the world had been replaced by a warm home overlooking the river, a house not filled with extravagance but with sunlight, laughter, and the faint scent of jasmine that always reminded her of beginnings. Julian Cross had become an inseparable part of that world. Over the years, their bond had deepened not through passion or drama, but through presence. He had stood by her through every challenge, his patience steady as stone, his understanding deep as the ocean. The public had long speculated about their relationship, weaving stories out of every shared glance and photograph, but Sophia had never confirmed nor denied anything. Love, she had learned, was not something to prove to others. It was something to protect. Yet those who saw them together could sense the quiet devotion between them, the way Julian's gaze softened when she spoke, the way Sophia's laughter came more easily when he was near, the way they shared silences that felt more intimate than words. It was during the second anniversary gala of the Elias Initiative that everything finally came full circle. The event was held at the very same Rosewood Grand Hotel where her life had once shattered, though this time, the ballroom glowed not with arrogance, but with purpose. The chandeliers still sparkled, but the air was different, warmer, lighter, filled with sincerity instead of spectacle. The city's most influential figures gathered again, not for vanity, but for vision. As Sophia stood backstage, preparing to address the crowd, her heart trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming realization of how far she had come. Julian approached her quietly, his presence as calm as always. "You've come a long way from that night," he said softly. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "That night broke me," she whispered, "but it also built the woman I was meant to be." He studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and handed her a small velvet box. "I was going to wait until after your speech," he said, "but somehow this feels right." She looked at him, her heart stilling as she opened the box. Inside was not a diamond, but a delicate gold ring engraved with a single word: Grace. Julian's voice trembled slightly as he continued, "You taught me what love means, not the kind that possesses or demands, but the kind that honors. I don't want to replace your past, Sophia. I just want to walk beside you in whatever future you choose." Tears welled in her eyes, not from shock, but from the serenity of knowing she had finally found something pure. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took his hand gently and said, "You already have." Then she stepped onto the stage, the applause washing over her like sunlight. She spoke that evening not as a woman seeking validation, but as one offering hope. Her speech flowed like poetry, about the strength found in brokenness, the courage born from pain, the light that always follows darkness. And when she finished, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Julian watched from the front row, his eyes filled with pride, not for what she had achieved, but for who she had become. After the event, when the crowd had thinned and the music faded, Sophia found herself standing alone by the balcony where her life had once splintered. The city stretched before her, golden and alive. Behind her she heard footsteps, slow, hesitant, familiar. She turned, and there he was, Richard Ashford. Time had changed him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by humility carved from loss. His hair had begun to gray, his posture less commanding, but his eyes, those same blue eyes that had once charmed the world, now carried remorse instead of pride. "Sophia," he said quietly, his voice catching in his throat. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I almost didn't," she admitted, "but closure deserves courage." He nodded, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I came to thank you," he said, "not for forgiving me because I know you never had to, but because you gave me the chance to see myself honestly. I've spent the last years trying to make something good from the ruins I created. It's not much, but it's real." Sophia listened in silence, then spoke softly. "I forgave you a long time ago, Richard. Not for you, but for me. Holding on to anger would have meant keeping you alive in my heart, and I needed that space for peace." He exhaled shakily, tears filling his eyes. "You're stronger than I ever deserved," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but we all become what life demands of us." For a few quiet minutes they stood together watching the city lights. It wasn't reconciliation in the romantic sense, it was something deeper, more sacred. A farewell not of words, but of weight. When Richard finally left, she felt no bitterness, only closure. His chapter in her life had ended not with vengeance, but with understanding. And in that understanding, she found freedom. That night, as she returned home, she found Julian sitting on the floor beside Elias's bed, reading him a story about stars and courage. The sight filled her heart with a tenderness that felt almost holy. When Julian looked up, his smile was gentle, his voice low. "He wanted to wait for you before falling asleep." Sophia leaned against the doorway, her voice a whisper. "Then let's not wake him. Let him dream in peace." Later, when the house had gone quiet and the moonlight spilled across the floor, Julian reached for her hand. "What happens now?" he asked. She smiled softly, her fingers intertwining with his. "Now," she said, "we live not as survivors, not as symbols, but as people who finally understand that every ending carries the seed of a beginning." The next morning, as dawn painted the river in gold, Sophia stood on the balcony, the wind brushing through her hair, Elias giggling in her arms, Julian's presence warm beside her. The world below buzzed with life, but up here there was only peace. She closed her eyes and whispered, "For every heart that's been broken, may it find the strength to beat again." And as the sun rose higher, flooding their home with light, it seemed as if the universe itself was answering her prayer. For the first time in years, Sophia Laurent's story was not about pain or survival. It was about love, forgiveness, and the profound truth that sometimes, when everything falls apart, it's only so the pieces can come together in a way more beautiful than before. End of story. Gala Night, the millionaire kisses his mistress on stage, while his pregnant wife with another CEO.